Yeah, the Dora Milaje from Black Panther are based on an actual all-female unit, but who were the Dahomey Amazons? Well, we're going back to the Dahomey Kingdom, which grew out of the Fawn tribe in this part of western-ish Africa in the early 1600s. More specifically, the reign of King King That, from 1645 to 1685. Somewhere in there, it's believed that the king created an all-female unit known as the Beto to use as elephant hunters. This was the unit that would become the Dahomey Amazons, though even into the 1800s, they still sometimes hunted elephant. At some point, they were made into bodyguards for the king, mostly because women were allowed in the palace at night while men weren't. Plus, the unit was made up of some of the king's third-class wives, using air quotes here, which were wives of the king who had been deemed not attractive enough to share the king's bed and hadn't bore him any children. By the way, I'm not saying that. That's directly from the only written account we have of them, written by Stanley Alpern, so don't get mad at me here. I'm not calling anybody ugly. By the time King Ghezo came into power in 1818, or possibly during his reign, we're not sure, the small 60 or so bodyguards had become a full unit of as many as 6,000 or as few as 1,000, somewhere in there. But why an all-female unit? Well, it's time we talked about slavery. As much as 20% of the slaves sent to the New World in the Atlantic slave trade were sold by Dahomey. That's around 2 million slaves. And keep in mind that the slave trade was alive and kicking in sub-Saharan Africa long before any European entered the picture. Now, I bring up slavery because between 1728 and 1740, Dahomey was pretty much constantly at war with the nearby Oyo Empire, who eventually won and made Dahomey into a tributary, and that tribute they paid was primarily in slaves. This meant that they had to raid other local tribes for said slaves, and because of constant warfare and the shipping off of slaves, the male population dropped significantly. Hence why about a third of the Dahomey military by the mid-1800s was made up of Mino, or our mothers as the male soldiers called them. And they were ferocious fighters. Their training included rushing and climbing thorn bushes to make them impervious to pain, and their first kill more often than not was part of a ceremony where they would go up on a 16-foot high platform and kill a bound captive, either by execution or by throwing them off the platform to the crowd below. This was also part of the men's training, by the way. The Amazons often carried out executions as well. Really, much of their training was to desensitize them to merciless bloodshed, and considering that they were used not only to fight other tribes but also to raid them and capture slaves, this desensitization was probably a good idea. It also helped that they had quite a few of these ceremonies, including a yearly festival known as Xwetanu, or yearly head business. That's literally what it means, where typically about 500 captives were sacrificed, often by beheading, hence the name there. Though in 1727 we know that about 4,000 captives were sacrificed or executed, or whatever you want to call it. Really, it's just 6 of one, half dozen of another at this point. They were treated rather well, the Amazons, not the people they killed, and they lived in the palace compound. Supposedly each of them had their own slaves, as many as 50, and were referred to as the king's wives, but then again, they were probably all married to the king, so yeah. And though they were seen as sexually voracious, again, they were married to the king, so they were probably also celibate. When they went out in public, a slave girl was said to travel before them ringing a bell, which told people to get out of their way and to not look at them. Yeah, you weren't supposed to even look at them, and if you touched them, oh yeah, that's an execution. The unit fared rather well against neighboring forces. Granted, a lot of their success was because their MO was to attack before dawn when the enemy wasn't ready. But they even helped with Dahomey beating back the Oyo and getting out from under their thumb in 1823. And they upgraded their weaponry to include rifles, though they typically fired them from the hip, which is a terrible idea outside of an 80s action film. Eventually, they came into conflict with those pesky Europeans. That whole scramble for Africa thing eventually, popped up. First, the British in the 1830s, who tried to talk Dahomey out of continuing in the Atlantic slave trade, then created a naval blockade in 1851 that lasted into 1852 to force them to stop. They did cut back significantly, but they didn't stop, but luckily they got into the palm oil business and that helped out quite a bit. But then here came the French, and that was back when that actually meant something. And though they had rocky relations, there was peace between the two sides, as in 1851 they signed a peace treaty to allow missionaries and French business into Dahomey. However, However, a place of contention was Porto-Novo, who was raided by Dahomey often enough that they asked for protection from the French and became a French protectorate. And then this guy, Bahonzen, became king in 1890 and pretty much immediately went about trying to reassert their dominance in the region by taking on the French in the first Franco Dahomian War. And yeah, 2 battles and 2 defeats later, they signed a peace treaty with France, giving up territory. Dahomey lost about 2,000 troops in the war, where the French lost less than 20. But the French were impressed with the Amazons, though they didn't do well against the French even in hand-to-hand combat. For 2 years after the war, Dahomey just rearmed and upgraded their rifles, but then they began raiding again. When the French sent a diplomat to find out what the hell was going on, they fired upon the boat, and the second Franco-Dahomian War began. This one lasted until 1894, and the Amazons fought valiantly, but were no match for seasoned French legionnaires, their final military action coming in the Battle of Cana. Supposedly, there were about 1,500 Amazons at the beginning of the war, which was whittled down by the French, again primarily in hand-to-hand combat, to about 50 by its end. And with the war's end, Dahomey became a French protectorate, and the unit was disbanded. And kind of a sad thing here, after the unit was disbanded, because these were women that were used to be treated, like royalty, a lot of them had a difficult time readjusting to society. Oh, and the Dahomey Amazons weren't the only female bodyguard. King Mongkut of Siam, yes, the king from The King and I, had 400 female bodyguards, though it was supposedly only for ceremonial purposes. I don't really remember that part from the musical, but maybe it was part of that, etc., etc., etc.